Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here, and this week I am very excited to welcome Miss Monica Johnson from SAMHSA, and she works with the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So, as I mentioned last week, we kind of had to shuffle things around a little bit for scheduling wise. So, normally for the whole month of September, we do suicide awareness. But for scheduling purposes, we have to circle back to it in the first week of October. So I'm going to go ahead and let Monica introduce herself and tell us what she does, who she's with, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Liz. Thank you for having me, for this opportunity to have this discussion, and for your flexibility around the schedule. So as you mentioned, I'm Monica Johnson. I am the director for the 988 Behavioral Health and Crisis Coordinating Office here at SAMHSA. That stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration under the United States Health and Human Services Department. And happy to be here and talk about all things related to 988 and crisis services when it comes to behavioral health care.
Yes, which is a big deal. And I'm so excited to have a guest of such big monumental proportions on this podcast from the government and someone who works so directly with suicide and with mental health crises, which is a big problem in America. So you started out the implementation of 988, and it used to be a 1-800 number to call for the suicide hotline. So this big long number that I think all psychologists had memorized. And now it's just a simple 988. You can text or call. So you started this in Georgia. So tell me how it evolved to a national level.
So it started at a national level. So there was a 10-digit number, like you referenced, the suicide prevention number was a national number. And what changed was 988 became law a little over 2 years ago. So July 16, 2022. I have a unique perspective in that during that time, I was in a leadership role within state government in the state of Georgia, and we were rolling out 988 locally. So I have a perspective of what it felt like to be doing this implementation locally. And then 6 months into that process, I moved into this role at the federal level and have since, I've been here a year and 9 months. And since then, I've been able to obviously have a different perspective, seeing what it looks like across the country as we roll out something so big, so significant, and just so transforming to behavioral health care, period. I've had the benefit of working in behavioral health for 27 years I've done all the jobs. I'm a trained counselor by profession, a licensed professional counselor. So just have a lot of different perspective in terms of the evolution of this work and why this moment that we'll talk about today is such an important catalyst in terms of how we talk about what individuals can do now when they are experiencing a behavioral health crisis, rather that is related to having thoughts of suicide, rather it is broader than that and having concerns about any type of emotional distress, or rather that's sadness, depression, anxiety, feelings of being lonely, whatever it may be, concerns about misusing a substance, or concerns about a loved one or someone else. And so we'll, I'm sure, jump into all of that, but that's kind of the perspective that I bring today.
Right. And which leads us perfectly into kind of our first topic, is this idea of who should use the hotline, because typically the suicide hotline was for someone who was experiencing either very close to suicide, or who was feeling like they wanted to die in the moment, or maybe someone they knew was experiencing a suicide attempt. And so that was kind of historically what the suicide hotline has been meant for. And so it sounds like 988 is meant to help people before it gets to that point. And so it sounds like your push is don't wait until you feel suicidal, if you are having just symptoms of any sort of emotional distress or severe emotional trauma, reach out to 988 before it gets to a crisis level. Is that correct?
Yeah, I like the framing of that in particular that so the scope is bigger. It still includes individuals that may be struggling with thoughts of suicide, but you're right, it is a broader scope now, and it really is about individuals that are having any type of behavioral health crisis. And I really love and want to underscore a point you made there around you don't have to wait until
Yeah,
you are experiencing a crisis, and then it kind of gets into defining what a crisis is, right? And for me, it is whatever the person says that it is.
right.
It is not up to me to tell you that at this is the point where you should call, but you don't have to wait until you feel like you're completely out of options. You don't have to wait until you really don't know what else to do. And so
Mhm.
the more people are educated and informed that this resource exists, the better. And so we don't do this in like physical health care. We
Right.
don't tell people to wait until you're having the absolute worst, response to a condition before you seek care. And this is in many ways similar to that. What's also important to note in terms of the expansion is that what we do know about lifelines in general is that most people, the vast majority, get what they reached out for, like what
Mhm.
they intended to receive when they contacted 988, just via that contact. And so we know that we are making a difference and that we are impacting real people, and people's lives are being changed because of this resource.
Which, I mean, sounds incredible. And I especially liked your analogy of you don't wait until you're having a full blown heart attack where you seek medical care, right? Hopefully, you're going to the doctor before that, and you're hopefully also doing kind of those things to help prevent a heart attack, right? And so 988, it's there to as a preventative measure. It's an added step to help prevent the suicide crisis that has been happening or that's kind of been globally rising for a while. So I would imagine one of the barriers, and I could maybe see this in myself, of one of the barriers to people calling is they don't know what to expect. They don't know what's going to happen. So could you walk us through that? Like what to expect, what you can expect when you text or call the 988 hotline?
Yeah, so I'm gonna back up one step and then walk into what happens when you contact. So there's three components to this 988 system that we've built, right?
Mhm.
So the first component is having a place to someone to respond. So it's the contact with the individual, place to call, a place to contact. The second leg of that stool is a appropriate response if that is needed for someone in person. And so there are people who do need a little bit beyond the call. And so that we're building out this system that if you call it and we cannot, meet the needs on that phone call alone, that we're also building out a system that can provide the appropriate response to someone that is experiencing a behavioral health crisis,
Okay.
working parallel with that individual to do so. And then the last leg of that would be making sure people can get connected to in-person help if they need ongoing support beyond the initial contact, beyond maybe a crisis type response, to divert a necessary police response when that is not what is needed,
Yeah.
and then connecting to ongoing help. So backing up to your question around what happens when you call. So an individual can call, can chat, can text with 988, and you're going to be connected to one of many crisis counselors, trained crisis counselors that sit within approximately 200 crisis centers around the country. So it does not matter who you are, what state you're in, where you're calling from, you're going to be connected to an individual in one of those centers. Our goal is to make sure that that connection can be as local as possible so that you can be connected to local things in your community if that is what is needed. But an individual has a couple of opportunities when they call. There are some connections that we have for some target populations. So we have a partnership with the Veterans Administration for their Veterans Crisis Line. So if a veteran or a family member of a veteran contacts us and they want to be connected to the VCL,
Mhm.
there is an option for that to happen. The Veterans Crisis Line, there's an option for that. If someone is Spanish speaking and wants to be connected to a Spanish speaking counselor, they can do that via call and or text. If they text Ayuda to 988, they will get connected in that way. And then we have a connection for individuals that are LGBTQI plus and want to be connected to people that are trained to support individuals in that space. And then we have an opportunity or a way for people to connect that are deaf or hard of hearing, and they use American Sign Language as their preferred mode of communication for video phone. So, which is very exciting for me. That's one of our latest additions. And then we have translation services for over 200 plus languages as well, available to be connected in those instances. So that's what happens when you call. That's who you're going to be connected to. And we take it from there.
Which sounds amazing. And I love how inclusive it is. I mean, because, as you said earlier, a mental health crisis, it's defined by the person, right? There's no definition of, or I guess you can't define a crisis, right? A crisis is defined by the person who is saying, I'm experiencing a crisis. And for whatever reason it is, whatever level you're at, that 988 number is a great resource. And one thing that I think is really huge too is this idea that you can text, which is, I think, perfect for youths. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they are digital natives, right? And so they've grown up with this technology age, and oftentimes they're more comfortable reaching out via text message than phone call. And so I think that's so important and so transformative for these youth who may be struggling with the mental health crisis and aren't comfortable talking.
Yeah, Liz, thank you. Thank you for that point. I have two young adults that grew up in a space that know nothing about anything beyond a phone and the internet space. We have definitely seen a spike in individuals that reach out via text. It is a growing popular modality. And I used to think about this in a way of, it's a great way to obviously meet young people where they are. Mm-hmm. But as I begin to think about it, I'm a 50-year-old woman and I much prefer to text with you than
right.
have a phone call with you. And so I think that just culturally speaking, as a whole society, that we're going to see some shifts there as well. But yeah, absolutely want to reach out to young people and make sure that, again, we're just meeting people where they are.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that I've seen is this, I guess you might call it mantra behind the 988 hotline. And so it's this theme of no judgment, just help. So it sounds like you are working to help change the narrative around mental health and suicide prevention. So tell me about that, where this no judgment, just help comes from, kind of what it's about, and what people can do to help push that movement forward.
Yeah, so we've spent a considerable amount of time being thoughtful, using research, like to really try to understand how to make sure that we're connecting in the ways that are meaningful to people. And one of the things that I know as just a professional just in this space is that behavioral health has been attached to stigma in a way that just quite frankly, again, does not exist in physical healthcare spaces. And so there is so many examples that are just all around us where there is unnecessary stigma that creates barriers for people to seek help, and sometimes not seek help until like way, way later when they could have been having some relief and some support. So it's important for us to make sure people understand that the premise behind what we do is that there is no judgment. We really want to make sure that people are just getting the help that they need. We understand that in some cultures, there is more stigma than maybe others, but it just exists, period, around just negative connotations. If nothing else, we just came out of a pandemic. All right. People tend to forget that. It seems so long ago, but it was not that long ago. Mm-hmm. And what we learned was that every one of us operating on a continuum of wellness related to your physical health, but also related to your behavioral health. Mm-hmm. And that all of us, nobody is excluded, are one situation, one incident, one unforeseen event where their mental health wellness changes just a little bit. Some of us may be equipped with some skills to work through that. Some of us may not be, but none of us are immune to experiencing a moment in time. It doesn't have to be about a diagnosis, right? It's about a moment in time where your mental health is not at its best state. That to me really is the no judgment, no help. We have to remove the stigma that is hurting people and making people be delayed in connecting and outreaching for support and help, because the society has created these unnecessary barriers just around perception, which is ultimately what stigma is.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, because a lot of times people think maybe I need some sort of a diagnosis, like maybe I need a diagnosis of severe depression to reach out. And that's just not the case, right? And I mean, I will say that at least we've gotten better as a society at accepting these kind of major mental health crises like severe depressive disorder or, severe anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. We're getting better. And I know in general, we're more accepting of just mental health being a thing, but we've still got a ways to go, especially in terms of access. I mean, I think one thing that drives me crazy is that they almost think it's more natural just to take a pill than to see a therapist. And I'm not saying that medication doesn't have a place, because I understand that it absolutely does. But I wish that more people would focus on the behavioral component, right? And the mental health component and these other things that you can do either in addition to or before you need the medication, right? So this idea of reaching out to people and finding resources within your community or, on a global level. And so, that's what I love about the 988 crisis line and this whole movement and this whole push that you're doing is that you don't have to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder to call. You can just be in a really rough time in your life and need extra help, extra support. 988 is perfect for that.
You can be all of the things, like all of the things above, right? So we typically talk about behavioral health, and it often gets relegated to a conversation about very specific disorders or diagnoses versus thinking about it on a wellness continuum. And so that I think messaging is important. And I think it's important too that, that everything is done in a person-centered approach. And so it is about what that individual needs and wants, right? And so very person-centered, very individualized to support whatever the individual may be experiencing in that moment in time.
Right. And their care should be led by them, right? Not just led by the doctor. I mean, patient care should be patient led, with the doctor providing that guidance and support. And I'm imagining that was your experience when you were a counselor and when you were counseling people, with probably this idea that your job was to help people where they were at, not where you think they should be, right? Or where you wanted them to be, but meeting them where they are in the moment.
Yeah, I think it's like with everything else, right? So with all the other parts of healthcare, that it should be person-centered. You know yourself best.
Yep.
And you work as a partner. I'm just thinking about my own doctor. We have a great relationship. She tells me things, I tell her things. We decide together on which path we want to take to move forward. That's what healthcare is together. It is working as a partner with your providers, whomever that may be, whether it's doctors, counselors, et cetera. But to me, everything should be anchored around a person-centered approach.
Yeah. Okay. So one other thing I want to kick back into here a little bit, kind of delve into, and that was one of the things that you mentioned when calling the 988 and this crisis hotline. And that is the idea of maybe sending somebody besides the police out. Because oftentimes in a suicidal ideation crisis situation, sometimes people feel like they need to dial 911 because they are in imminent danger to themselves. And I'm not saying that you should dismiss that option, because sometimes there are instances where that is appropriate. But tell me more about this idea that of 988 being a resource other than police officers who, as much as they can do wonderful things for community. I mean, I wish all police officers had more training on how to deal with a mental health crisis and, kind of the unique situation that is rather than, I don't know, it's different. Do you understand where I'm coming from here? Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. It's an important one. It's one of the top questions that we get in this space. And so when we talk about building out the system, and I kind of walk through the three legs, one of the key components of this, and probably one of the most important components, is the interoperability, the coordination between local, like 988 response and local police response, right? Or emergency just dispatch, right? So rather, because it could be a paramedic or whatever, but this that coordination is important. So out the gate, let me say, 988 is not meant to replace a need for 911.
Right.
But what it can do is to deter or move away individuals that if they know that 988 existed, they could have reached out to 988. 911 has become the catch-all that we all use for everything that is like maybe an emergency, maybe urgent, maybe somewhere below. I've had an opportunity to speak with law enforcement across this country, and I hear the same thing, that they love that 988 is an option.
Yes.
And we know it's going to take time. Like, it's going to take time. 911 was not like born overnight. We are 2 years into 988. It's going to take a long time before it's baked into the fabric of a culture that is used to you dial 911. So we want to be able to deter individuals that don't need an immediate, rescue. So think about it. You call 911, you got emergency dispatchers that can go through red lights, that can do the things. That is not what we don't have that equivalency for 988. And so, yes, if there is a life, threatening situation, but what we find is that many times there is not. And when there does need to be a response, that if the response can be done by a trained or a team of trained behavioral health professionals, often called mobile crisis in the behavioral health world, that you can not have to involve the police and the individual can get the healthcare, the behavioral health care that they need. We also understand that there's multiple entryways right into this crisis space. So people are still going to call 911. And I'm not going to say don't. Like, if there is a life-threatening, you believe situation, then you should do that. But this is where those collaborations with the behavioral health system and the crisis system is so important, because there are also alternative models. One that I'm starting to see more of and saw a lot of in the state that I came out of was co-responder models. And what that looks like is when you do call 911, if that was your entryway, that entity already has a partnership with a behavioral health provider, crisis responder, and they can jointly respond to a situation. Because there may be cases where both things are needed. And so part of this work is really building on those foundational things, building on the work that has been done for many, many years around CIT, which is a crisis intervention training for law enforcement, when they can't have a co-responding approach or whatever that, that may look like. But yes, we want, and I will say, this is what police tell me, we want to not respond to things that we feel like somebody else more experienced and this is in their lane should be responding to. If there is a public safety risk and threat, the police want to be responsive to them. And if it's something that the behavioral health system can help support and move individuals away from contacting 911, or in some instances receiving a response that is not the most desired response, then this is that moment in time where we can make those changes and really, I think, move the needle here in a really significant way over the next several years.
Which I absolutely love, because you hear of this death by cop, right? Or people who seek out, or who they're so desperate to die that they might seek desperate measures. and maybe think that law enforcement is an option. That's not something anybody wants, right? It's not something the family wants. It's certainly not something that the police want. And that's so tragic. And so I love this idea of a co-response because I think you're right. We should not mitigate if there's a public health crisis or if there is an immediate threat to to someone's life or someone else's life. Sometimes you need that response. But, I love this idea of de-escalating, right? Or attempting to de-escalate or having somebody who can maybe just show empathy and de-escalate the situation before it gets to that type of negative crisis or negative outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, which is just fantastic. And I hope that this is something that can continue going because it's such a fantastic resource. Okay. So, final question before we wrap up. So, 988, it can be a broad resource for a range of behavioral health issues. So, do people gain access to these resources just by calling or texting? And could you maybe explain what some of these resources are?
Yeah. So again, going back to person centered, right? And so it depends on what the person needs. Are they calling on behalf of their child, themselves, a family member, someone, a neighbor, someone they saw on the street, what have you? So all of those things would be, predictable. I mean, would predicate what would happen there. But sometimes people often don't know where to start. So let's give a real life. Let's do a real life scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's say this is why this is so important to me. Let's say I live in Georgia and I am visiting California, and I am having a situation that feels like is emotional distress, right? I feel stressed. Prior to 988, I wouldn't know what to do in California. Like, I
Right.
would just be like, think I'm having a panic attack. I feel like a lot of anxiety, and I end up in maybe an ED because I did emergency department room because I didn't know what resources were available to me because I'm in a place that's unknown to me. So what's different now is that I know, and hopefully some
Hmm.
of your listeners will know after this, that no matter where I am, I could dial 988. And if I need, again, just some engagement support on the phone to help me work through what I'm experiencing, in this example, maybe some heightened anxiety, I would have that resource. That's pretty incredible. And then if I needed some support based on, I need some ongoing connections, then that crisis counselor can help me navigate that to be able to do that. So rather I need to get some help where I am, or I need to do that once I'm back, we can work through that. I think that's pretty remarkable and quite a catalyst for change in terms of how you access care. Many people don't know how to access behavioral health care services until they need it.
Yeah.
And so this now becomes much more a part of our conversation. I agree with you earlier about stigma is better. Like
Yes.
I think we are in a different space. I think a lot of that is due to younger generations coming of age and being our future leaders. They have a much different perception around this than some of the older generations do. And I think that's a game changer. So I think that's why, I mean, the resources can look different based on where you are. That's why we see this as a partnership between federal government and local state government and local entities, because the resources can just look vastly different. And so we want to make sure those local connections happen. But that's my real, like, let's play the scenario out, and
Yeah.
then just fundamentally why this collaboration is important at a local level as well.
Right. Oh, and this all sounds fantastic because, we don't want to negate or dismiss 911 because, I mean, that is an important community resource, right? And 988 is in addition to that. It's just an additional resource. It's almost like it's making it better. It's an enhancement, which sounds fantastic. Okay. Monica, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for being a guest on the Mental Health Matters podcast. This was a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for your work and keep at it.
Thank you so much, Liz. I've enjoyed this. I'll come back anytime. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will take you up on that. Okay, so next week, Dr. Burton is going to be back with us, and we are going to circle back to relationships. So stay tuned for that, and we will see you all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.